No, beautiful.
When do your kids go to bed?
Oh,
9:30.
I don't know where that is. I'm gonna look at it.
Yeah.
Like my kids, you can get them to bed.
I love that. I don't. They like to go with
Yeah.
to bed with them.
Dave, you think? You are. For the public meeting yesterday.
all right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Georgetown University's Masters of Educational Transformation Speaker Series for Spring 2024. I'm Sabrina Wesley-Nero. I'm the Director of the program. I'm very excited to have you all here tonight. The Masters of Educational Transformation seeks to prepare educators and education policy actors who want to move education toward justice and equity. And we do this through a graduate program in education policy, a teacher residency-based graduate program for aspiring educators, and a professional development program for experienced educators. We also advance this mission through public-facing events like the one we have, where we engage with scholars, leaders, activists, community members, and educators. And tonight, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Trish Morita-Mullaney. Dr. Morita-Mullaney is an associate professor at Purdue University and holds a courtesy appointment in the Asian American Studies program. Her research focuses on the intersection between language learning, gender, and race, and how this informs the identity of educators of multilingual communities. Guided by critical and feminist thought, she examines how these overlapping identities inform the logics of educational decision-making in multilingual families. She has studied the Lau case and how it was developed, experienced, and implemented by the Chinese American community of San Francisco, representing the original history and voice of Lau. She has a forthcoming book on the Chinese perspective of Lau, Multilingual Matters, that will be published here. And we are very excited to have her here this evening. We welcome Dr. Trish Morita.
Thank you, Dr. Sabrina. Thank you so much. It's so good to be, I want to clap for all of you. It's good to be here this evening, and I know that most of you have worked, well, all of you have worked all day, and you're coming here this evening, so thank you for being here. And really quickly, let's go around the room, say your name, what program you're in, and if you speak a language other than English, would you state what those language or languages are? Let's start on this side of the room.
All right, I'm Sabrina Wesley-Nero. I am with the program Educational Transformation, both concentrations, and also the undergraduate program in Educational Inquiry and Justice. My languages are English and Spanish.
Evan Donnelly, I'm with the Learning and Teaching concentration, and I also speak Spanish.
I'm Jordan. I teach across two.
Hello, everyone. I actually graduated already. I was in the master's degree of communication, culture, and technology, and I am also a member.
Emily, I'm in policy and advocacy, and I only speak English. Caroline, I am also in the policy.
Andrew Garcia, with teaching and learning, and I speak Spanish and English.
My name is Reina. I am in learning and teaching, and I speak Spanish.
My name is Ray. I'm in advocacy and policy, and I speak English, and then like 70% fluent in Spanish. I used to be completely, but not anymore. There's a story to that, I think.
Hi, my name is Viridiana, but I go by Vidi. I have 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Ñañú, which is also known as Otomí.
Where's it from?
It's from Hidalgo, Izmiquilpan, in Mexico.
My name is Makaya Moni. Advocacy and policy track.
I'm Alana Edmond. I'm part of the advocacy and policy track as well, and I only speak English.
Marilyn Acosta Sanchez. English, Spanish, and
Hi, I'm Lourdes Ortega, Interim Director of Transformation. Spanish and English, Greek.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Sinclair. I teach in both concentrations, but primarily in advocacy and policy, and I speak English.
Hey, everybody. I'm Ann Yuska. I'm the program manager for educational transformation, so I also cross. I am an English speaker. I was a Spanish speaker, but no longer, and I can a couple of words in several languages.
It's good for that everyone's here. We may not all be multilingual, but we are all glossic. We think expansively about language, race, about our identity. So thanks for bringing those forward this evening. So let's jump in. Today we're going to talk about some really nerdy stuff, but it's also, I think, really resonant for what you all are doing as in-service teachers and also as policy advocates in different agencies and communities throughout the greater DC area. And so I'm going to take you to the other side of the US, to the San Francisco Bay Area. Anyone ever been? Okay. Anybody from the Bay Area? I'm originally from there, and you'll learn a little bit more about that as I talk more and more. And can you all hear me? I'm getting over a cold, so I want to make sure you can hear me. So the title is Learning from Lao, Languages Right, Resource, Problem, Choice. And this is something that I talk about in my book, and I put a scan up there to do a raffle when it comes out. This is my first book, so I'm really excited. You can scan that, and it'll show up a couple times to sign up for raffle when it comes out. Dad gets the first copy. So you're going to meet him in a minute. So the title is Lao v. Nichols and the Chinese American Language Rights, the Sunrise and Sunset of Bilingual Education. And so you can kind of see this arc, and that's how the story goes. And I'm going to give you a very small snippet of this. We're going to spend a lot of time on the lead up to Lao and immediately following Lao. And then I want to be able to think aloud with you about what Lao means on the ground for you here in the greater DC area. So this work intersects a lot of different areas. I take a look at language rights, Asian American studies, and also critical theory. And you'll see more about what that looks like specifically, like how do you mush that all together. I love how you all said, oh, I'm into concentration, I'm cross-concentration, like that must be Georgetown language, right? But to me, it's about intersectionality, right? These things can't cleanly sit into one silo. They're all very, very integrated. So I get to know more about that today. So because I am very much into critical theory and believe in critical theory, because it's a way of looking at the world that always addresses disparities, always is looking at things with somewhat of a suspect eye. And that often gets me in trouble, right? And I always say, I'm not getting in trouble. I'm just bringing up, I'm amplifying things that perhaps you have not seen. And so this critical consciousness is super important and comes from the work of bilingual scholars, Cervantes Soon out of Arizona State, Palmer. It's about historicizing. We're going to do a lot of that today. We're going to find out about Lao. I know that a lot of us have read about Lao, but I'm going to go into the depths of like, who was Kinney Lao, like this little 8-year-old kid, which is something we may know a teeny bit about, but we're going to go deeper. Critical listening, we really listen to these voices. When we think about Lao, we usually think not about Kinney Lao, we just think about bilingual education as a whole. And that's a way of really banishing and muting the identities of Asian Americans, experiencing discomfort and interrogating power. So a lot of my work revolves around this, particularly in this case of Lao v. Nichols. So the way that I kind of approach the book and the way that I'm going to approach the talk today is I use this particular methodology called narrative policy portraiture, and its policy is experienced by the implementers. Some wise professor told me, laws do not change beliefs. You can say it's a law not to carry a handgun into a school. someone would say, well, I don't believe in that, so I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. So that's what's hard. And you all have policies that come down the pike into your schools or into your agencies, right? But you might say, but I don't believe in it. Okay. And so those are our identities that are speaking in our head and in our hearts that are kind of informing that. So I was really interested in not reading about case law, and I did do a lot of that, but I got super overwhelmed because I don't speak legalese. I'm not a lawyer. What I did is I started talking to the people that actually did the policy work on the ground. Then that discourse of legalese started to make sense. What I do is I put forward the actors. And in this picture here, this is in Chinatown. This is probably circa 1975 to 1976, after Lau v. Nichols has passed, the seminal case that ushered in ESL and bilingual education on a large scale for the nation's identified English learners. This is Lucinda Lee, and Lucinda Lee was a second grade teacher of Kenny Lau. And she is here at Cameron House, which is basically a community-based center. You all should look up Cameron House because they have an incredible history of doing a lot of grassroots things in San Francisco. But here she is in what she believes is the church basement of Cameron House. And she's talking to the Chinese and Chinese American community about the provisions of language rights and what these mean. Here she is doing this. To me, that's Lau, right? That's Lau v. Nichols. That's the case right there. She's a player. And I draw also from my own experience with my dad, who's a photographer, my sister as well. My son is a budding photographer because he wants to be like grandpa and his auntie. But foregrounding is a technique used in photography where you like put the main image in the front. And we all have Instagram feeds and Facebook, right? We do these catchy things with our phones where we bring the person to the foreground, right? And what that means is there's something in the background that's familiar. So what's in the background? Golden Gate Bridge, and where is that? San Francisco. Has it been there for a long time? Pretty much anybody can see that and would know this location is in the US, it's in California, a famous bridge, right? But you have this dog that's sort of interfering with the primary image with which we are familiar. Foregrounding is like bringing the person to the front. So just how you saw Lucinda in the last slide, right? In a way, when we are in the front of this thing called educational policy, when we're in the front of it, we're sometimes that annoying dog that's like, you know, looking for equity, foregrounding equity. And so that's kind of the approach that I take. And that's my cute dad. That's him on the day that I got my PhD.
Aww.
Oh, this is amazing. I'm invoking my father. Hi, Dad. You'll watch this later, I'm sure. So I have to bring my identity to the fore. My work began in ESL and bilingual education, both in California, Arizona, and then in Indiana. And you'll see me here many years ago with my students on the State House steps in Indianapolis, Indiana, advocating for state funding. As I look at those kids that represent 4 or 5 different countries, and Jaime, who's hiding in the background there, who is a DACA student, is undocumented, and you can see that they're all racially minoritized, right? Hispanic and Asian. And here we all are advocating at the steps for there to be funding with Senate Bill 202. And these kids got 600 elementary students to write 4,000 letters to legislatures. And as a result of it, and the efforts of many other districts, this policy passed. So this to me represents agency identity right in the mix. And so for me, this is the foregrounding, right? So do you see the background? There's the Capitol, right? Bridge. There's us in the front saying something else needs to be done. So I draw from my work as a language educator. I also draw from my family's history. And so this is a picture circa 1947, 46, 47, and it's in Amache, Colorado, or Granada, Colorado. Does anyone have a sense of where this might be? Some of us may not know about this history, so, okay, speak up.
46, 47, it's an
Internment
internment camp.
An internment camp, all right. What kind of internment camp? Japanese American, mostly Japanese American internment. So some of you may not know this, but during World War II, U.S. dropped bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And then after that, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. It was bombing of Pearl Harbor, right, which is in Hawaii. Lourdes knows that, right? She lived there, right? So bombing of the Japanese of Pearl Harbor, and suddenly the U.S. government regards all Japanese, regardless of citizenship status, as a suspect class, and they are rallied up and sent to what we call incarceration camps, not imprisonment camps, and sent away to live in these camps. Everyone in this photo is a U.S. citizen, except for my grandfather, George, or Hanami. He was a U.S. resident, right? But they're all legalized bodies and people, yet they were incarcerated because they were regarded as possible enemies and people that would participate with the enemy. None of that was ever proven, but my dad and his family spent about 4 years of their lives in 2 different incarceration camps. My dad is the cute one there on the far right. So, and this summer, my dad, myself, and my 3 siblings, we are all going to return to the camp that my father went to over the 4th of July weekend. We're going to be able to do history pilgrimage with people from all over the US and Japan that come to this event every other year. So I share this because when we think about Asian Americans, and we're going to be talking a lot about Chinese Americans today, when we think about Asian Americans, there is a history of subjugation of Asian Americans, Asian bodies in the US, right? Pulled upon for labor, regarded as suspect class, meeting the loyalty aims. One of the things that happened after World War II was over, and even during World War II, is Japanese Americans joined the army. Why did they join the army? To show their loyalty, show their English proficiency, show their race and identity as having a national origin of American, even though they didn't look like it. So you see this history of subjugation with many Asian communities. And you can also see that with the Chinese, who were brought over to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, the building of it. They were paid appreciably less. They were treated very badly. Their wages were much lower, and they lived in very difficult conditions, very unsafe conditions. They are largely responsible for this plot of railroad that connects the Midwest with the West Coast. See a history of subjugation. We also see a more recent history of what we call valorization. Right? Subjugation, valorization. We're going to use you, but now we're going to valorize you. We're going to talk good stuff about you. And so you can see here that this is that same family, my dad's family, with grandpa. Grandma had passed away at this point. You can see them all grown up. They're in their John F. Kennedy attire. And Aunt Amy, oh my gosh, that hairdo is just hysterical. And then we see Grandpa George. But notice their attire, and also notice their names. What do you notice about their names? Very anglicized, right? It's not Takashi, right? It's not Masao. It's Dean, Paul, Harvey, Jerry. They all have Japanese middle names and last names, but they have anglicized first names. Then, so that's language, right? Do you see how language is being situated there in a very interesting way? I also want you to notice what Grandpa Morita is holding in his hands. The Bible. The Bible. So I learned from my dad just a few weeks ago that he and Grandpa went to the local church in town And I said, was it a Japanese church? You know, a Japanese American church, because they lived in a Japanese American community post-war, World War II. He goes, no, it was a totally white community. It was a very evangelical, you know, speaking in tongues type congregation. But we went, and Grandpa converted and I converted, and we became this really active Christian family. And so I said, so why did you go to the white church? Why didn't you go to the local Japanese American church? Or why didn't you go to the Japanese American Buddhist temple in your community? Because we wanted to go there. And I said, well, why did you want to go there? He goes, he's like, I've never thought about it. Right? He had never thought about it. My dad is quite elderly. He's like, and what he recognized in that moment is that there was this connection to whiteness, right? And that whiteness gave you power, it gave you capital, right? And so going to that church helped him have that power and capital. And also being a Christian gave him that capital. And so it's really important for us to keep in mind that churches and religions have had a lot to do, Christianity in particular, have had a lot to do with English language teaching across the globe, right? The missions in Chinatowns, San Francisco and New York, all over the country, Chicago, they use the missions, they would say, come learn English. The goal was conversion. The goal was evangelization. So that's something really important to keep in mind about the role of religion in language teaching. Anyway, so today we're going to talk, I'm going to shift gears now. I'm going to talk about something called language as problem, right, resource, or choice. And this isn't my work. This is Richard Reese's work from many, many years ago. I've added in choice because language planning in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of dual language and bilingual education programs around here. Do any of you teach in districts or schools that have these programs? And how many of you in the programs that you're in, are they blended where you have English speakers in with Latinx students, perhaps? Yeah. This is where maybe it is a choice to go to a school like that. Whenever there's choice, you always worry about whose rights are being met and whose demands are being met. There's a difference there, rights or demands, right? So we'll get into that more here in a moment. So when we think about language as problem, sort of like we're here to help, right? We're going to help solve this language problem, which oftentimes is done with English teaching or total submersion, but it's on a very big, swift transition. Let's get you away from your native language as quickly as possible and swimming in English. And when we go back to the policy of the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, that was largely founded on these principles. So when you think about this, this is where I'm going to give you a minute to turn to your colleagues, turn to your fellow students, or fellow faculty, or what have you, and just speak really briefly about, in your particular context, how is language perhaps construed as a problem? Speak to one another. How is language a problem in your context? Okay.
In the childcare field, ways I childcare workers who the care and not having,
You know, like they don't use it as another
and scaffold playing. It's just not educate right and respect.
So then they have to sort over the money.
Teach in English, right? That's a barrier.
Vivian, who's very adamant that
Not working.
Standardized
Just
tests
break up
in our
just
education and specialized. They're like in international English tests. It's in math, in English. Very frustrating.
And while I was
Yeah, we got the course today.
But like it's.
In our Spanish course today.
A lot of information, even if you're doing.
And also, if you use the Hispanic voices are being validated on the and the answer is scared to make that.
another one.
And then we use both are just about.
Yeah, no, I agree, you know, but like, so it's like what the.
I know, yeah.
So. Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm just like.
Allows them to do because of the.
You could.
Right?
Standardized tests are in.
Their entire lives.
No, I know, but I'm just, so that's why they don't want school to be bilingual, because they're basing on it.
That's part of the.
Necessarily that like has to take language. No, yeah, I'm just confused, like.
Did take, there was just.
Like,
Have to go.
Okay. Together.
Exactly, it doesn't.
I feel like I'm interrupting some really good stuff. So in your particular context, or even experiences, in what ways language framed as a problem?
My school, I'm in a bilingual school, but I was sharing with my team that we had today and yesterday the ANET test, which is in English. So it's frustrating for the kids because they don't speak English, a lot of them. So they're just in front of the computer and trying to figure out, or with the dictionary, trying to figure out 100-word paragraph, text with a dictionary that is, it takes them like 5 minutes to find one word that they cannot connect to any of, So it's very frustrating for them. And today the teachers got the results. So all of them were very disappointed because the scores were very bad. And I'm like, of course they're bad because they don't speak English, but they don't see that. They just start sending emails saying, oh, this teacher had the best scores. Yes, because she doesn't have a lot of newcomers. So they don't differentiate, and it's very frustrating, especially because it's a bilingual school. So yes, we have to teach in Spanish, but the standardized tests are in English, so it doesn't make sense. The same in math. They had math today, it was in English. The ones that could figure out the numbers, they were kind of good, but the ones that couldn't read the questions, they were just wasting their time in front of the computers.
So testing in English, it's language as a problem. They're not English proficient enough. We know that, right? They're not English proficient enough, so they're not going to perform well on a standardized test. Testing becomes a mechanism of judgment and evaluation. And I think there's a difference between testing and assessment. I'm not going to go into big detail about that, but testing tends to be sort of like the final blow. So when you hear the teachers talk about, oh, this teacher did great and this one didn't do so great, what does that do for you?
We talk a lot about that because a lot of the ELA teachers don't like the bilingual program for that reason. So when they see the scores, they see the Spanish class as a waste of time because we're not doing anything for them to learn English. So it's very frustrating, and not just for us, but for them too. And I understand because they are being graded because of those scores. So their grade is going to go down because of the kids. So it's a lot going on. And they start also having mixed feelings with the students. Or you're not making enough effort,
And the school's going to look bad. So you're going to make me look bad, which is going to make the school look bad, even though it's a very faulty argument, right? Obviously, if they're not English proficient, they're not going to do well in a standardized exam given. The testing is language's problem situation, right? And we see even if people really, they may, this is where people are really sort of believing in the outcomes of this test, right? Believing that it is accessible and you can do it if you try hard enough. Or if the teacher tries hard enough, they're going to have better outcomes. And that's, every classroom portrait is different. Testing language is a problem. Good one. Others, yeah.
I think culture, language is a problem. Especially because for me, my mom recently told me the reason why I didn't learn my native tongue growing up was because she had a conference with a teacher told her that my native tongue might be confusing me learning English. And because I was also speaking Spanish at home, just all those three languages was going to be too confusing, and main focus was for me to do well on the exams, well in class. So my mom stopped teaching me native tongue and grow up with my native tongue, which also meant that I didn't grow up with a lot of like cultural aspects. And so I feel like that's also a barrier in terms of identity or English.
When you think about, I mean, do you speak Spanish now? Did you reclaim it or?
I speak my native tongue now, which is Miami, but I'm still learning. I'm not gonna say I'm proficient, but I'm trying.
So this is the thing, is that mom, teacher said something of judgment and evaluation. That the school policy? Maybe not, maybe yes, maybe not, right? But you see how her beliefs arbitrated what your mom ended up deciding to do. How does your mom feel now that you're regaining, you're reclaiming your native tongue?
She's shocked, honestly. She also feels like she's lost her native tongue. It's been getting harder to speak to grandmother. And my grandmother only knows our native tongue, only a little bit of Spanish. So even talking to her, it's like really hard, and that makes me sad. I feel like I'm losing.
Yeah. This sense of loss, right? It becomes cumulative. It's just a little bit each time. Your mom's thinking was, I'm doing what I should be doing for you because the teacher said. And so this is how assimilation goes. One teacher that says that, and maybe another teacher nods at it the next year. Another teacher does another tinker, and then suddenly it's just how it is. Then later you're like, oh, what happened? These tiny little moments can become cumulative, particularly if language is constructed as a problem every single year. I'm just thinking in your school, kids, a particular set of kids are constructed in the same way every single year. That's sad, as you said. Very sad. Anybody else want to say anything about language's problem? The next thing we're going to look at is language as right. This is having access to any type of public good or service in the languages that you need them. We're in Washington, D.C., so I'd imagine if I went into a local hospital or a clinic, I would probably see signs posted in multiple languages. We're in D.C., voting rights, you definitely would have ballots in languages other than English. And the ballots being other than English actually happened around the mid-70s, right as Lao was being ushered in. So freedom to be able to express themselves, right? And I'm hearing from many of us in the room that that's not necessarily the case in schools and even in families. So, and that government and state resources are committed to this right. So if you go to places, big cities like this, you're going to see more of this be very present. If you go to places that have smaller, what I would call more immigrant destination sites, like where I live in Indiana, you won't see as many of these resources up there. Even though they're supposed to have them, you won't see them because language And then we have language as a resource, right? That we look at this additively. That is the aim of a bilingual education, of a dual language education. But I'm hearing from some of us that on the ground, that doesn't always manifest, right? It doesn't always happen. If we look at language as a resource, as an asset, something additive, it helps every language that's considered subordinate. It lifts it up. It can ease tensions across language communities. It eases tensions between the bilingual teachers and the ELA teachers, as you were saying, right? If we look as language as resource. Right? Because just because they're monolingual English speakers doesn't mean that they can't be additive about multilingual. I think people think I only speak English, so I'm not heteroglossic. Right? But you can be monolingual and be very additive and heteroglossic. And then basically this points to a need for cooperative language planning and cooperative discussions. So oftentimes what I find in bilingual schools is what ends up happening is we talk about the curriculum, the scope and sequence, when is the testing, right? How are we going to staff the next grade level? But you're not talking about beliefs and ideologies. Right? Why not? Because that's too personal, right? But as we know, policies don't change beliefs, and beliefs arbitrate what happens on the ground with bilingual children and families. So with that in mind, I'm going to move to the next one, which is language as choice. And this is a growing line of my research around the gentrification of dual language education, which is they're increasing and scaling the availability of bilingual and dual language programming. In my state alone, we went from 3 programs to 50 programs. Now, I know that's not a lot relative to DC. You guys are a much bigger place. But what I'm getting at is people are cashing into this dual language agenda because it brings people to, keeps people in the seats. Because there's choice and people are moving, it's who's the shiniest, who has the most beautiful boutique bilingual ed program coming. So we use this as an attraction to bring people in. And what problematically happens is a lot of times language minoritized, the racially minoritized are not the primary benefactors. This is where you have language as right for our multilingual families, of language as choice for our more privileged families. When you have that in the mix, you have clashing ideologies. What you just shared about your bilingual school is a clashing ideology. And so that's what's hard when you have an orientation of language as right and resource, but the school has language as choice and has different constituents, you have 2 competing ideologies. So let me just share there, stop there. And so I'd love for us to, why don't we just openly share about this notion of language as choice versus language as right or resource. How is that happening for those of you that are in bilingual schools or in bilingual communities? How's that playing out? You can speak.
I can speak for her. She has choice in her school because the kids can, the parents, you have 2 programs, continue.
Thank you.
Introduction.
So in my school is a dual language school, and I definitely, when you were saying the point about it being interest conversions and having it be available for given mostly to like the privileged group. So the school itself is in a very privileged like area. It's in by the zoo, so it's a really nice area. So there are a lot of families who fall into that category, and I think what Sandra and I were discussing is that sometimes families enroll their monolingual children and they're monolingual themselves into the programs, and then there is a struggle because they're not continuing the bilingual and Spanish learning at home. It's only in school. And so there are a lot of cases that by like kinder, first grade, the families decide to move their children out of the school and they transfer them to the monolingual neighboring school as well. So we do see a lot of that. And that's why I was telling her that there is a monolingual option that sometimes families do used to take.
So, and is your whole school a dual language school or is it just a strand?
The whole school, so it's a pre-K to 8th grade.
So you're saying that the Spanish-speaking families sometimes move their kids out after a couple.
No, sorry, the English-speaking families, because they don't, so unless they do make the effort to continue the Spanish learning at home, some of the families move them out, but yes, so there's a choice in I guess enrolling them into the school or unenrolling them.
Yeah, so they've got sort of a menu of options. They can get a steak or fish, right? They can get, right? But then you're saying maybe for the kids that are more local, probably your racialized linguistic minorities, that likely they're the ones that are staying.
So I think I wrote a paper about that with Professor Essner. The DC lottery system is very complicated, and I learned that during the summer. And so it's harder for the bilingual students to actually get into the school because a lot of the families who live in the area are like white privileged families, so they're the ones who have the priority in enrolling their kids into the dual language program, and the ones who are from other wards in the city have to enter a lottery to be able to attend.
That's what you call demographic gentrification. There's 3 types: demographic, programmatic, cursive. The demographic is why is the dual language school in the most privileged part of DC? Why isn't it in maybe a more blended community, a more Latinx community? Right, and that's language planning, right? That's like, where do we, but that's demographic gentrification. So when the districts are getting together and they're talking about this, what I generally find is it's the superintendent, the board, and the student assignment coordinator that are making the decisions about it. Guess what? Are they representing linguistic communities of the partner language they're going to teach? Usually not, right? So language planning should be community-based. For those of you that are in community centers, are you ever brought to the table when a district is deciding to start a bilingual or a dual language program? Those of you that are in community centers, have you ever been invited to be a part of language planning in a school district? Hush, right? Because we don't operate that way, because choice operates on a market economy, right? Doesn't really operate on a grassroots, like what are the rights of people in this community. All right. Others around choice. You want to say anything about choice? For it.
Not related, but something that we're advocating for at work is the language programming and these programming is concentrated in like the non-Black areas of the city. So east of the river, there's like none or very few language programs. And part of that, from my understanding, is that like yes, so the public school district doesn't like really support those schools as well. And then the other part is that if you're a charter school, you get you get granted the charter first, and then you have to go find the building or space. So they usually buy up spaces in certain areas of the city. They're not equitable where they're placing those.
That's evidence of demographic gentrification, not just for dual language, but just school placement. And this is us in a post-Brown area where we don't use the mechanism of racial integration. really what we were doing is we're arbitrating lots of things. And the student assignment system that you were talking about, the lottery system, is very but if we look at it really methodically and go back to like the 60s, there are reasons that different decisions that have been made along the way, including that you can't use race in student assignment anymore. Use language, but in some cities, in some states, US, you can. It just depends on what your local federal courts have decided. One of the big things around magnets and lotteries is that in most parts of the country, you can't use race as an identifier. I don't know about DC. You can't use race. Language can be a proxy for SES, for low or high, not necessarily. So you can see how complicated. This is what choice does, right? And choice really started to emerge around the 60s and 70s, around the civil rights movement, where people were moving away from the notion of self-determination and were moving to this notion of market economy for school. Language was used as a tool for that. Okay, I'm going to get into some super nerdy stuff, but I'm going to have you apply the super nerdy stuff in a minute. So this is a theory that I've drawn upon for many years, and she's continuing to build upon this, as are others, but this is something that came into the world in 1999, and I wish that we had this when Lau was going on, because I think it would have been a very helpful tool. But one of the things that we often think about when we think about blacks and whites, we tend to think of them in very binary terms, black or white. And then everybody in between, Zeus Leonardo says that Asian and Latinos and First Nation peoples are perpetually in between two bookends. And so this is what you call proximity to whiteness, proximity to blackness. Usually you only hear the term proximity to whiteness. So what she talks about is that AAPIs are always seen in relationship to this racial continuum. So they are either seen as superior, remember, valorized, dad and his grandpa, superior or inferior, or foreigner. So depending on where we are in the scheme of time, depending on where we are in our social context, that little dot can move around. So this was insufficient for me because it was really hard for me to get this captured in my head. So I drew from some work around Langcrit and ratio-linguistic ideologies, and I call this the matrix of racial and linguistic positioning. And it just helps me to really think about the actors that I introduced to you earlier, about how they are positioned. So I put this here. So if we see the solid line, that's race, black to white. And then language is the vertical dashed line, non-standard, standardized. What we might sometimes call elite bilingualism or elite languages and a street or subordinate language. I should say that how you speak, maybe standard or non-standard. And so you'll see these lines that go, the script that goes across on the italices. So how is race imposed, assumed, appreciated? Language. How is language imposed, assumed, appreciated? I give you the example of when I taught service teachers for the first time at Purdue, and all of my students were white, every single one. And mostly from Indiana. And I walked into the room and I immediately saw their shoulders kind of get like this. And I had just come from a faculty meeting, and my colleague who was white and my other colleague who was white male, they said, oh, my classes are really full. I have like 35 students. I'm like, and so I wondered why that is. And they said, oh, it just might be the schedule, whatever. So I come in. But as I came in, I read the room You're smiling, giving me eyes, right? I read the room really quickly and I could see that they were just sort of looking at me, right? They were imposing something. This is where they were making decisions about who I was, how good my English was, my national origin was, before I even said anything. So as I read this language in the room, I decided to just be quiet for the first 5 minutes, look on the roster, set up my computer, you know, being the ethnographer and doing a lot of suspicious listening. And anyway, and then I introduced myself in the way that I introduced myself to you not long ago. And I could see their shoulders go down. Now, I can't prove this. I didn't interview them. But this is an example of an identity being imposed upon you, where they were imposing a national identity of foreign upon me. They were also identifying me linguistically as a non-standard speaker. So they were concerned. So I didn't teach that class again. Not for, I mean, there was other, that wasn't the only reason, but I always wonder, I'll never know because I didn't ask them. I should have gotten an IRB for that. Why they chose Wright and Britch and not Morita. So that's an example of identities as imposed, and you can see how it goes along those two different access points. I think I'm going to just move. So what I did here is I want to look at this from the perspective of the agents that I introduced to you earlier. And this will be really helpful when we get into our discussion of Lao. As you can see here that my dad's only English language is English, right? He was very encouraged to speak English, and absolutely discouraged from using Japanese. Went to Americanization school at camp. And yet he still has traces of his mother tongue, and his English is his sounds are very rounded. And he speaks a particular variety of English. And when he gets together with his siblings, I can hear it. But my dad has always worked really hard to be like this. Has a high degree. He's very educated. He worked with a lot of white guys, right? And so he knows what it means to work towards this aspiration of the capital of being white, including going to the evangelical white church. And you can see for language is that, you know, it's pretty standard, but it's not necessarily down on the bottom, meeting absolute standard. I think about Kenny Lau, the 8-year-old who came as a newcomer from southern China and spoke Cantonese as his first language. He was regarded as non-standard because his elocution was very low at that point. He was not producing a lot of English words. So that was considered non-standard. He was definitely another country because of how he dressed and behaved. And so he was imposed as sort of moving towards Blackness. I don't mean that in a horribly negative way. I just want to say that as it is. For us to kind of see this in relationship to one another. And then Jaime, who was my student, who was a DACA student, undocumented, right? Jaime was conscripted as Black because he was like the student that didn't do well on that achievement test. The teachers were mad at him, right? And so he became aligned with the underachieving Black students. And so he was imposed in that way because he was a newcomer. He was regarded as a non-standard speaker. That's like the teachers, the society, people's descriptions of them, sort of like, what do we say, sounding like race, looking like language. Jonathan Flores' work, that before you open your mouth, people have an idea about who you are, what you do. But if we look at how my dad sees this, it's really different. My dad sees that he has worked in a predominantly white profession, that he has been very successful, right? And that he has written a book, he's written articles, and he has a really high index factor on Google, right? So he looks like he has met, you know, all of the entailments of that, right? So he basically is okay with that. When I talked to him about the incarceration in camp, do you know what he says? Camp was fun. It was fun. Now, he was 8 years old. He was very young, right? Camp was fun. Isn't that interesting? Right. And that's something very distinctive about second generation immigrants of color. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but oftentimes parallel a lot of standards of whiteness with language and race because of the capital it presumably offers them. Then if we look at Kenny Lau, right, he over time, and there's only one article that I can find on Kenny Lau, he is a history. He regarded that he did better without bilingual, he didn't have a bilingual education because the law didn't pass in time. He had mostly an ESL education, and he said, I don't know why they gave me ESL. I just wanted them to dump me in the mainstream. Just wanted them to leave me alone and just make me be normal. And so he positioned, assumed and negotiated himself as I moved towards standard English because I was in a sink or swim situation, which was an effort of moving towards whiteness. And then when we think about Jaime over time became English proficient, over time became a college graduate. I just saw him at a wedding. He's such a handsome young man. And he can ebb and flow, right? He trans languages, he's very fluid, he can move across different spaces with great efficiency. But he has also learned with time capital of whiteness and what it offers to him, what he needs to do in order to keep jobs and to get better jobs. So it's interesting how you are seen and how you negotiate yourself in and out of that. Those are the pernicious ways in which language and mix up. Are there any questions? Like that was like super heavy. You guys need a second to talk to each other? You turn and talk. Lecturers and faculty, please jump in. Staff, whatever you want to say.
So I thought I could tell you that English is not my first language.
How are you?
So that's why it's so
It's good to be here. Thanks for sharing.
I know, to me, let me put what I'm saying, I realize that it's not about friendship with you, so with the person.
Check boxes. Always
Right, it's always the places.
I'm not sure what box. That means testing those you can't change.
No.
One chance.
Saying the framework is like.
May not reflect how you see yourself.
The implications of the framework.
And I personally would be wrong. God may say.
I know.
Lots
I
of
don't.
well.
I was thinking that too, I was also at work in a, you know, typically along these lines. And then
problem and
The people, like how, what are the implications of that? So this is black, like, you can't, you can't, yeah, that's what I'm saying, but overall, the way we do it is like.
Yeah.
That's one way that we negotiate.
Like,
Like,
the Turkish
money. Yeah.
So now,
Yeah,
like,
well,
I
it's-
And I guess also
have both of our charger. I share it with her. And I have her charger. She was like that as well, so like a lot.
He said like.
US and also like.
Your body.
Been doing it since.
Minorities.
Hierarchies,
So they
right,
think
like,
that.
yeah, happy to have these kids.
That's what this is what happened.
Right, yeah. And then also you. Native speakers. Like students.
It looks like it.
I'm trying to get away.
Yeah. Probably long, like how. How is,
There's lots of research on that.
It wasn't for research.
Okay, anybody want to share out?
I don't know if that's what you're trying to have.
Anybody want to share out?
Everybody throw you in the.
Anybody want to say anything? Like you said, what you need. Okay, let's keep rocking. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, we're going to go into a bit of history, and this is going to tag back. Oh, you wanted to say something? You
Yes,
go.
I'm being encouraged to work this question out and kind of looking at the matrix of racial and linguistic positioning. I want to know, like, what are the implications of Black speaking here in relations to those who can like assume or negotiate race?
Like the people that are in between, so to speak. Well, I think we're going to get into that much more deeply as we move into the Lau case, particularly with Lexing. There are problematic features of this, but I think the big thing is we often hear that there are conflicts between Asians, Latinos, and Blacks, that it's sort of like this competing thing, like we're more white, you're less white. Very problematic, but the bottom line is that is operational tenet of absolutely is. We hear about API, like stop API hate, right? When you hear about that, the first image that probably comes to your mind, Black people beating up elderly Asian women. And if you look at the statistics and you look at the reports, there is more white on Asian crime. That's not what's put in the press. It doesn't get tweets, it doesn't get likes. Or sexy to say Blacks and Asians. Think about Koreatown, Rodney King case when the riots broke out in Los Angeles, right? Where African Americans looting Korean stores and Korean owners standing up and shooting, right? And they're saying, look, they can't get along. But what they don't understand is you have the white bank owners that are leasing the property to the Koreans. Koreans have higher economic means and are able to lease these properties. That's all done in relationship to unequal lending, which is a feature of supremacy. The bottom line. So I think this continuum can help us really point that out, is that the goal is not whiteness. That's not the goal. The goal is to interrogate whiteness. So if we are using these mechanisms to push people towards one side or the other, right? Because I don't like the idea of pushing anybody to a side that's inferior. Right? What we need to do is lop off one side. We just need to blow it up and start over. And that's the process of, I mean, it's very feminist of you, and I love that, right? Is that it's what you call deconstruction. You have to deconstruct it. And oftentimes when you deconstruct something, we have to take away the thing that is the centering sexy mechanism that we want to aspire to. You have to get that out of the realm. So let's just take that side off, right? And then what would that look like? What would that look like if we recentered people of color that are regarded as minoritized? If we did that, would we even be using the term minoritized? Right? We'd be using terms such as superior, inferior. And so Kim's work on this from 1999, she actually looks at the research in eugenics, right? About how, going back many years, about how the relationship of Blacks to certain animals, Asians to certain animals, Hispanics to certain animals, whites to certain animals. And obviously the white animals are soft and lovely, and then the ones for people of color are really. But I agree with you that it is problematic, right, that we're doing this, and it takes our eyes off of who's running the show here, what's really going on. Tell me your first name again.
Okay.
Hi, you go. Yeah.
Good question. Who placed who? Lee Lau was probably not alive when he was being placed on the spectrum. But did your dad or Jamie know? Like, this society would place themselves, or is this how?
So if you look at the red there, this is how my dad places himself. This is how Jaime places himself. And I know that because I have a relationship with them and I talk with them often. For Kenny Lau, it's from primary documents, right? So there's a couple of news clippings, him talking about how he didn't want language education because it made him stand out. Wanted to blend in everybody else, and one of the ways to do that was to just be a part of the greater. Also described, his teacher described him as a really shy kid. So that's not his narrative, that's the narrative that he offered. So the assumed or negotiated is really, this is how they want to see themselves. That's how they want to see themselves. If we go back here, this is how other people see them. Again, as Micaiah has said, if we blow this up, what does the matrix look like? Here's your doctoral dissertation. I think you should do it.
If I can get funding, I definitely will.
Okay, there you go. Let's keep going because I want us to really think about this deep piece and then how we can connect it to Lao. So now we're getting into Chinese American history. How many of you have taken an Asian American studies class? Anything on Asian studies? Anything? So glad to see that. You should take one. It's super, super, super fascinating. So I want to talk about Tape versus Hurley. This is the family. Which one? What do you think they are? Are they the Tapes or the Hurleys? Both anglicized names, right? One of them is German. The Tapes is the Chinese American family here. We have Joseph and Mary Tape, and their 3 children. And their oldest is Mimi Tape, middle. She, like Kenny Lau, was 8 years old, wanted to go to school. They lived in San Francisco. They were one of a few Chinese American families that lived outside of the Chinese Quarter in San Francisco. Joseph was a drayer. He would take his horse and buggy and go down to the docks and pick stuff up, put it on his truck and bring it and deliver it to different places. He also at one point ran a funeral home. He would ship bones back to China when people away, send them back to their families through their family associations. But Mary and Joseph wanted to send their children to school. Spring Valley was one of the first, I think it was the first public elementary school in San Francisco. And at the time, there were only 3. San Francisco wasn't that big at the time in the 1880s. They want to send her there. School is all white. And they say, please enroll my daughter. She is 8 years old. She is eligible. We live in the neighborhood. Say no. Because you're a Mongolian. These will bring bad measure to us, and they are turned away. So Mary Tate, the mom, gets really pissed off, and she goes to the California Supreme Court, files a case. Tate versus Hurley. Hurley is Jennifer Hurley, the principal of Spring Valley, and basically sues them and says, you need to let my kid into school. And she takes it to the Supreme Court, and guess what? She wins. They take Mamie back to Spring Valley, and suddenly Mrs. Hurley is like, I'm sorry, you don't have your vaccination record. Remember, disease-ridden? Oh, we're too full. We can't admit you. The Supreme Court of California said that my child can go to school. They have a right to a public education because she is US born. Meanwhile, the school board and the superintendent are working with the California Supreme Court. Just a few days later, they say she can have a free and public education, but it must be separate. This is the whole notion of Plessy versus Ferguson. It was not anywhere near not fair resources. Basically, that's what ends up happening. So when this comes down the pike and they are throwing this at her, she takes to the papers. This is one of the earliest Chinese American feminists in San Francisco, Mary Tate. She says, didn't God make us all, right? So here she's invoking religion, which she shares with the school board and with the superintendent. My children don't just dress like the other Chinese. So here's something interesting. She's dismissing her own racial community. She has moved up in class and stature, with language and religion. She was saved from a Chinese brothel, Aaron House, and was educated by a woman in a basically a mission. So she was a converted Christian because of the rescue. Goes on to say, kids play with all Caucasians. And it seems no matter how a Chinese may live and dress, so long as you know that they are Chinese, they are hated as one, as a collective. There is not any right or justice for them. She takes to the papers, and she does this consistently. But this is Superintendent Mulder, who was the first superintendent of public schools for the state of California, who comes to San Francisco upon his retirement to be their superintendent. And he basically goes on to say this, whereas in the state, there is an earnest and concentrated effort being made by the Caucasians to rid themselves of the Chinese element. It will injuriously affect our future welfare. And basically directing no principal, teacher, or employee in the public schools department of the city employ, patronize, or encourage the Chinese in any way, but do all in their power to legally promote the removal from the coast, discourage further. This is in and around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese were largely excluded, and they represented one of the few families that were able to make it through before this was in full force. So they were somewhat of an anomaly. Some people would call them an outlier. So you can see the tension here, but basically, Jenny Hurley turns her away. But what I find really interesting here is that when we think about Mary Tate's letter, we see her efforts of valorization. Remember how I talked about Dad and Grandpa in the Bible and the church? See how Mary Tate is doing this. So this is historic, right? This is a historic mechanism. So John should be Joseph, they got it wrong, and Mary, courted and were married. John built a neat little house out in Western Addition, San Francisco, where in due time, 2 little Tapes appeared, Mamie and John. It was an American family in custom, costume, and speech. The mission folk used to take visitors out to the Tapes and exhibit them as examples of how Caucasian, Mongolian. You see how religion and language are used as mechanisms to valorize them. Mary takes that on. She adopts that and she uses that as a strategy to try and get her child into school. That's an example of subjugation and valorization. So we can think about subjugation and valorization. So my family, the Morita family in camp, how subjugation followed by valorization is this notion of you made it. Christian, you have a college education, you make a good income. Right? But this is also the early auspices of what we know as the model minority stereotype. And then it can happen within time, right? Which was the case with the tapes, right? Is they're being subjugated, excluded from school. They're trying to valorize themselves, but the system isn't taking it. I mean, go back to Micaiah, it's the conditions of white supremacy. So I think it's really important, though, to think about subjugation and valorization. I'm using this specifically to look at the AAPI community, but this is certainly something that we can think about for other racialized communities. So again, back to the matrix, right? Were imposed as being in proximity to whiteness, standardized, right? We can see how what the district thought of them, that they were not white, they were Mongolian, right? Mongolian back in that time, constructing them on a continuum closer to blackness, right? And that their language was somewhat non-standard. There's critiques of how Mary wrote in the paper. But Mary takes us on in a very different way, where she's putting herself in adjacency or in proximity to whiteness, right? And that she speaks standard English, as do her children. You can see how there's a big difference there. So this sometimes is a lot of what we're addressing in schools. How kids are seen are not how they see themselves. How families are seen are not how families see themselves. That is oftentimes the tension and the conversations I wish would happen in parent-teacher conferences that don't always happen. So anyway, the outcome is Mary and her brother go to the Chinese primary school, which is a separate, very unequal school. And it eventually would become the Oriental School, which would include all AAPI groups, Japanese, Korean, in this school. Eventually, when the Chinese Exclusion Act ended, I shouldn't say that. In the 1900s, things started to ebb and flow and some things began to change. All right, that's way back when in the 1880s. Let's move to the 1950s and take a look at Brown versus Board. And how many of you have studied Brown v. How many of you have sort of an idea of it? As we know, Brown is about busing and racial integration. And then we know about Lau v. Nichols, about an ESL or bilingual education for the Chinese. So there's some really big differences between Brown and Lau that I really didn't think about until I talked to Ed Steinman, who's the lead lawyer for the Lau v. Nichols case. He's a character. The Brown v. Board of Education, we have the family that has to walk across town to an all-black school through railroad tracks. It's about 2 miles. And their neighborhood school is just down the street. It is somewhat integrated, but she has to go to the all-black school. And so then we have educational access for language, right? Is we need to have access to our first language to be able to understand the academic content. So what Steinman helped me understand is that Brown was all about what's happening measurably, formulaically. If I go to school, I go to Spring Valley Elementary in San Francisco during busing, is there an equal distribution of different races in this school building? Literally, the principal would meet them at the door and say, here's our roster, here are the races of our kids, and they go, okay, you're integrated, done. Never open the door never went into a classroom to see what was going on, to see how teachers were treating kids. Hyman argues that Lau v. Nichols looked at educational access beyond schoolhouse doors. It actually went into the classroom. It looked at who was standing in front of the kids, how highly qualified were they getting access to their first language as a means to access content. I think it's really important to understand the differences because this also has led to a lot of the collisions between Black and Asian communities around integration, language rights, racial equity, language equity. Right? Can you do both of them at once? That's the question, that's the contemporary question for dual language education. Travel distantly on foot. Let's move forward to, that was around the 1950s. So scaling busing across the country took a long time. I would say in DC, it probably didn't hit you until the late 60s, early 70s, right around the time that Lau was starting to take hold. So we have the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which is regarded as one of the largest immigration bills in our nation's history, and that was a long time ago. Most of us were not born by this time. Basically, it prioritized family reunification, refugees, and it set a quota of 120,000. I don't know what our quota is now, but it is not anywhere near that. So what happened is this opened up the floodgates from Asia, specifically China, and there was massive immigration, and San Francisco welcomed many children from southern China who spoke Cantonese, Tuishanese, different varieties of Chinese, Cantonese. They were brought in by boat, and they stopped at Angel Island, which is just outside of San Francisco in Marin County. And they were processed through this camp. European immigrants were processed very quickly, unified with their families very quickly. As anybody of Asian descent, specifically the Chinese, would be detained there for months at a time, and in some cases, years at a time. If you ever go to San Francisco, go to Angel Island. It's an amazing history because you can actually go into the barracks where they stayed in. They write in Chinese about getting out of here, be with my family. Those things have been preserved because someone in the park services noticed them. He prevented the building from being demolished. Because that history is carved on the walls. We can see that the Chinese were really regarded as a suspect class. It goes back very deeply. Most of them came from the Guangzhou province, right? Back then they called it Canton, but today we would call it the Guangzhou province. And Cantonese is the first language. So that's really different from the influx that we're getting now from China. Most of the Chinese coming to the US now speak Mandarin and are from mainland China, whereas at this time, most are coming from southern China. Lucinda Lee is Kenny Lau's first teacher. And this is her, this is a terrible picture, but this is her in a coat closet, teaching a bunch of kids, they're all sitting on folded chairs, and she was an ESL. She was a first grade teacher. She taught in a storage closet. One of her kids' names was Kenny Lau. She said, we found space wherever we could. I can think back, I was an ESL teacher and I taught in a hallway. Right? So some things haven't changed much. This is what she says. She says, I was Kenny's teacher for 1 year at Gene Parker. His mom came in and said, Miss Lee, can you teach my son math in Chinese? I'm bilingual. And I said, actually, the language of instruction is English. I can't, but I can take him in after school and I can work with him before. She said, no, it won't work that way because he's going to keep getting further and further behind. I want his class to be able to learn English and learn the other subjects in Chinese. I said, that's not how the system is set up. Remember the bridge and the bulldog? This is Lao as the bulldog. Whole system, bridge, not how the system is set up, not how we do things. How many times have our families been told that, well, that's just not how it's done here. We don't do that. And so you can see, even though she shares a similar linguistic and racial heritage, that she still is inculcated into bridge is good, not how we do it. So what happens next is Lucinda is connected with, her boyfriend connects her with lawyer Edward China, who I just talked about via phone. And basically she tells the story of Mrs. Lau, and that's how the case happened. Phone call. That's it. Phone call. The storytelling can be the impetus for something enormously profound. So these little moments that you have with your students, that you have with your families, may seem really simple, but they can become. So he works in coordination. So this is the thing. The white lawyer who's working for a civil rights or legal clinic, a free legal clinic, he doesn't work in isolation. He works in collaboration with the Chinese for Affirmative Action, with Ling Chi Wang, who went on to have a very long career at UC Berkeley. And they work with two sets of plaintiffs, Chinese students with no language provisions that are thrown into a sink or swim. That's Kenny Lau's story. And then Chinese students not taught by a bilingual teacher. Mind you, at this time in San Francisco, in Chinatown specifically, almost all of the students are newcomers, like level 1. And so there was an emergency. He filed this class action suit in the district court in March of 1970. Then as Lau is brewing, SFUSD busing, this is where the Brown case is coming from. They're all happening at the same time. So the local interpretation of Brown in San Francisco is Johnson versus San Francisco Unified, where David says that his daughter Patricia has unequal access to quality schooling, school buildings, school resources, teachers, and he wants an integrated education for his daughter. So the protests begin. So if you've ever been to San Francisco, there's this portion called Hunters Point. And this is where historically there was a very active naval base. And they recruited African Americans from the South to come live in San Francisco. Housing was provided, and they worked there and made a good living. And at the same time, they were such a wonderful workforce, as stated by white academics at San Francisco State, that they actually had an admissions agreement that they would deny African American students if they wanted them to work. It went from like a 9% down to 1% in the course of 3 years. The military worked in collaboration with the state to do some very exclusionary, awful things in higher education. Anyway, that's ground zero of Hunters Point. This is where the story begins. And so comprehensive busing program is established for racial integration. It is regarded as the most comprehensive racial integration case in our nation's history. We looked at 7 different racial subgroups. And this is interesting, Micaiah, because this comes back to, in most cities where busing was done, you were either white or black. Me, you know what I am in Indianapolis, where we have a white-black formula when busing happened? You know what I am? I think I am. Am I black or white? White. Latino students, you know what they are? White. See what happens? This isn't policy, right? So it's like all the rest of you are white. If you're ascribed as white, then your integration pattern and what school you go to might be different. You could have a totally black and brown school and would be regarded as integrated. So that's what's interesting about most of the country and what's distinct about San Francisco. So 40% could have no more than 40% of one subgroup. So you see all of these zones, right? It's called the horseshoe plan because I guess if you look at it sideways, it looks like a horseshoe. I don't get it, but anyway. So basically, you have like 300 buses. And mind you, kids are mostly going to their neighborhood schools. They're using public transportation. Suddenly, there are 300 buses busing kids from one end of the city to the other. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, it is only 7 miles by 7 miles, but you cannot get anywhere in 7 minutes in San Francisco. Right? It takes anywhere from, depending on where you are, it can take over an hour to get from one end of the city to the other. So as these plans are coming out, we must realize that in Chinatown, the schools are very, very segregated. The Chinese parents in Chinatown, they do not want to have their children bused. So what happens is there is a construction of them by the African American community, by the white liberal community. The Chinese are uncooperative, are badly behaved citizens, that they are perpetually foreign. And so there's this description of them very negative. And I'm going to really unpack this, but they are claiming that we want to have autonomy, we want self-determination, we want to preserve our language and our culture. So this is their call for language rights. What language rights? What's important to realize is that in Chinatown, for many, many years, there are Chinese after-school programs that are quite robust. There's like 7 or 8 of them. They're based in the churches. The students are developing their Cantonese and Chinese skills in these after-school programs. They would go 6 days a week. Still go to school after school. Since COVID, they've turned into Saturday school. And there is concern that they're going to evacuate. And so they plan this protest. They start something called the Freedom Schools. This has nothing to do with Freedom Schools of the South, where African American students are excluded from schooling and people come down for the summer to offer education to them, communities throughout the South. What this is all about freedom from mainland China. Actually, sort of a ploy, it's a nationalist ploy to align themselves. It's actually trying to shed their identity as communists. They're trying to shed their identity because they want to be regarded as democratic. Being regarded as democratic is a means of being affiliated with whiteness, being affiliated with English, being affiliated with Christianity. So, basically, the buses start rolling, and you have 1,400 plus students, which is 24% of San Francisco Unified's former Chinese pupils that are not there. They're like, we're boycotting. What I find interesting, and it's hard to see here, but the kid in the front row is a white kid. His name is Brian Addison, was the only non-Oriental youngster in non-young school today in Chinatown. Do you see how you have anti-bussers who are white? You have anti-bussers who are Chinese, how they work in cooperation, sort of converge their interests on having homeschooling, which is a proxy for anti-Blackness. Absolutely. So they basically operated for 2 years, but by then San Francisco was starting to loosen its racial integration plans. And the Chinese were saying, we need more bilingual programming. You need to get Lao going. And this is before Lao is happening. What's starting to happen is that Commodore Stockton Elementary in Chinatown in 1969 had started a bilingual program in the schools. It long existed in the churches and the community centers, but suddenly they have a program, bilingual education in Cantonese and English. So a lot of people think that bilingual education in San Francisco for the Cantonese started in 1974 when Lao passed. It actually was happening way before that, 1969. So basically that program where Lucinda Lee went to go teach, she ended up recruiting those families away from the Freedom School, come to Commodore Stockton, San Francisco Unified School. They received an integrated education, racially, either language rights at the same time. really sweet, nostalgic moment. Basically, this is a shot here, but this is her racially integrated classroom, right? The 1971-72 school year, and they are receiving a bilingual education. This is a mixture of kids from 3 different communities: white, Japanese, African American, Hispanic, all coming to Chinatown to go to school and receiving a Cantonese bilingual education. So this is what the Chinese students said about their racially integrated education alongside of their language rights for Cantonese maintenance and development. So this is Melissa. Melissa's talking about her own family's dislike of the Japanese, given Japan's historic invasion and occupation of China. But when Melissa heard Megan's story, Megan is Japanese, her perspective began to change. Melissa said, "I love Megan," it's Japanese American. One of those things I still remember about her concentration camp. She did a presentation, and to this day, I still remember the concentration camp and what she's gone through. My mom would say, "Oh, Japanese don't like Chinese." And I'd say, "Huh?" I mean, it just comments like that. And, you know, I think about it, but I didn't give that personally. You know, sometimes with the comments, you know, you can say, you know, it kind of affects the way you think. Then you kind of know better, as you go further in your life. So everybody's created. What was so important about this is we saw this isn't a focus on language. This is a focus on humanizing pedagogies. They're really curious and connected with each other. And then Medora, who is white and describes her family as super liberal, coming from Noe Valley, said, I had great teachers and they were really dedicated and they really wanted to do something new and innovative. She's talking about the cultural landscape of Chinatown. She only goes to school there. One of my favorite trips, just not even a field trip, was just going out around Chinatown, and she bought a box of chai siu, which is barbecued pork. She fed everybody a piece of chai siu. And I was like, this is the best thing ever. So delicious. What I think is important here is I always get worried about food fashion festivals and famous people, right? That we do a lot in dual language and bilingual schools, right? Because that's so esoteric and sometimes can reinforce stereotypes if we do too much of that. But what she's doing is she's taking them outside of the playground across the street to a local market. The kids are seeing it prepared, cooked. They're seeing all of the women from the community buying their groceries locally. So those are the sorts of things that were really helpful, is that this strange place of Chinatown became humanized for her because she had a local context for it. This particular teacher, she took them all over San Francisco. In fact, the kids drew a mural, and that's going to be the cover of it. 1974 comes and Lau v. Nichols prevails in the Supreme Court. Woohoo! The Chinese call it a day of victory. Right? And this is in Chinese in the local. Edward Steinman is now a law professor at Santa Clara University, and he's driving in his car. Says, lead story, 8 News, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously court to avoid the constitutional issue. Oh, shit. Because, of course, to legalize, you won over the Constitution. That was the reason it was unanimous, not a constitutional decision. That means the decision could be changed by Congress. We made a decision based on statute or in law. It's actually federal regulations. Those regulations would be. But Edward Steinman really wanted this to be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 14th Amendment, on which Brown v. Board of Education is based. That didn't happen. Kind of split the difference with him. So it was a Civil Rights Act of 1964. What that means is that if Congress decides to get rid of Lau, good, because it's not regarded as a constitutional issue. I think what's so important to me is that the Chinese, and you're going to see this in a second, even though it wasn't a constitutional issue, the amount of agency that they put into it, that's what made the difference. Remember how I say laws don't change beliefs? To see how this manifests. So as a lawyer, he's really disappointed. Mind you, he was 25 when what happens is, as Lao gets passed, the Association for Chinese Teachers, and by the way, up until the 60s, there was a 3 Chinese quota teacher. Only hired 3 Chinese, right? It wasn't written down anywhere. It was understood that only 3 Chinese could be hired. That eventually got lifted. So there's more and more Chinese teachers, particularly given the migration from southern China. And so you see Chinese Association of Teachers doing skits and programs with the Chinese families. And this is a really funny picture, but it's a teacher with a wig on and they're pretending to be white. And they are yelling at the Chinese kids to speak English, right? And the kids are talking in Chinese, like, I don't understand. And they use this as a way to engage community members about the importance of using Cantonese as a means for them to access content. And the people that are doing this leadership are the American-born Chinese that become activated as a result of the civil rights movement at their local university, San Francisco State. That's another story. The other thing that the Association of Chinese Teachers did, TACT, they worked in solidarity with African Americans during a time of great reduction in force where people were going to be laid off. I grew up during times where there was a reduction in force. I don't think we have that phenomenon anymore because there's a teacher shortage, but they worked in solidarity with, it was called the Ethnic Minority Educators, which was a Black coalition of educators. They worked together in solidarity to avoid layoffs. African Americans argued we should not be laid off. The premise of Johnson versus SFUSD is that the community looks like us. Because of that, they were able to keep their jobs. The Chinese teachers kept their jobs. They were bilingual teachers. They worked in cooperation. Was there tension? Was it difficult? Absolutely. It was an effort at solidarity, which exists today, which is good news. Chinese for Affirmative Action also formed the Bilingual Community Council, which still exists and still advises San Francisco on these things. We have Laureen Chu here, who is a character. She assisted in the preparation of Chinese American-born Chinese teacher workforce, and she got funding. She got funding from the Office of Bilingual Education, and she is responsible for educating most of the Cantonese bilingual teachers. Let's see how the universities became involved. And then this is interesting, is that TACT worked with the Chinese for Affirmative Action, and they did this beautiful series where they took to film and the arts. And this is what I love about community centers, right? The films and the arts. But this is an African American child on a bus with a Chinese student from Chinatown and a white student. They're all getting picked up on the same bus, and they're all arriving at Commodore Stockton to go to the bilingual program. White kid is making fun of the Black kid who speaks Chinese. The Chinese kid is challenging the white kid around his monolingual lens. And it's this beautiful exchange. But what's so cool about this is the kids created this script. This is grassroots. Okay? This isn't some policy person coming in and providing this agenda. The kids are doing this. It's a 5-part series, and it won an Emmy Award. And somebody actually found the archives and found them. This is where I'm going to invite you all to kind of talk, take a moment. You might need to write this down, but can racial and linguistic equity coexist? Language rights, like a bilingual education, racial integration, operate concurrently, congruently. Forks into the language's right, language's choice. Let that ruminate. Why don't you take a minute to write? And to write is helpful. Evolution writing to Another 30 seconds. Okay. Let's jump in. Aaron. Yeah, why don't you guys share with your partner?
Lena, the thing that's very
Than others, racial identity. However, even work on it. And then. Yeah, because if I think about it as naturally half of them would have an effect But I wonder, like, because like those sort of what would be like for
They don't wanna go to prom. I think or like
time though, or would you like, oh, I don't think it's happening right now. She's other
for all the things that I have.
I do wonder how that would be even run in the So I wonder like what would that, if it can't, how do you? Also think about for that student, do you like yeah.
No, you're all good. We're not gonna go
We're both,
over
yeah. Which I did. Not just like a bullet.
Oh,
Technically, like, yeah, just like that really lets you know.
things move so.
No, because I think she's out of. Her, I'm so trying to, you never should have turned up. Share campus level, I think that's not my resume. I speak 8 languages, right? I think like, anyways, I'm just so smart at like, applies to their language.
Languages reserved.
But like the mentality of.
I keep hearing that.
I've been
Friends? Yeah, anyone want to share out? Say you want to share out, and then the next thing I'm going to ask you, do you have any?
So, we were discussing how, difficult sometimes is, again, same topic, because, with my school, they try to make things, I mean, promote equity and, all the things that we're trying to do here, but at the end of the time, at the end of the day, we're fighting the system. So as long as everything is embedded in the system, it's very hard to offer equity, racial and linguistic equity. And also, we were questioning ourselves if, to have this racial and linguistic equity, we need to offer the students not only two languages, but all the languages that they speak at home. That, for example, I have students from Africa that they don't speak Spanish or English, and they are not getting any equity at all. So because we're bilingual school, we think we're offering this equity, but it's not as it seems. So we were wondering if there any way to offer this to everybody. So Reina had a great idea that she's not gonna share, so I wanna say using technology. She's gonna hate me after today. Using technology would be a great solution to offer equity for those students, to maybe a software that can translate for them, but at the end of the day, it's like, it's not equity because they're not receiving information from a person, but from a device, and it's translation is not always accurate from the technology, so what translate not accurate.
Especially for the different Spanish. Question. What, from your definition, what do you think the difference multilingualism and bilingualism?
Yeah, I kind of probably use those interchangeably, but multilingualism, I think, for me, I kind of define that as from a translanguaging perspective, which is drawing on all of your resources, linguistic, semiotic, multimodal. It doesn't have to just be speech or written text. I think as for English proficiency, right, we look at listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then we believe that those are the only things that language. Yes, those are big features of language. There are other elements that bring life to language and bring meaning. Just reading about how people who sign bring different understandings and meanings to language because of the way that they sign or express themselves. And so we need to have affordances for that. And I don't want to be too Debbie Downer, like this is, we're in challenging spaces and this is a very challenging time. But as you mentioned, schools are very pernicious. They want to reproduce themselves. They want to be the same. And, Jean Anyon, I don't know if you all have read Jean Anyon, right? She says, you can't just use schools as the engineers of equity. It's got to be much bigger than that. She talks about when you plat land in a new community, you can't just have gated communities, apartments. You need to have rentals, gated communities, homes, libraries, clinics, grocery stores, schools. And if you do that, racial and linguistic integration will probably happen. You have a geography set out that way, and then it's not the job of schools to tinker with. It's the job of the system to transform itself. And I think there's some work in New Mexico being done on that, but it's on a very, very small scale. I think what's hard about work like that is that I'm sure that you all have Is there a KIPP Academy in DC? There's lots of them. So the KIPP Academies came out of New York. When you listen to the origin story of the KIPP Academy, it's pretty cool. What they did is they said, let's scale it. Let's put it everywhere. Like we have a couple in my city. But what happens is when you scale something, you aren't really mapping demographic terrain and the ideologies in the local communities. And that's what happened with the original KIPP. That's the thing that I worry about is that we're very much in a market economy. When you're in a market economy, it's all about choice and scale. So places like the KIPP Academy are trying to duplicate, they're trying to reproduce themselves, and we're going to make it grassroots over here. But anytime you move something from here to there, then it's not really grassroots anymore. It's not coming from the community, it's coming to the community, and you should come to school with us. Jean Annion, amazing. We're at 7, so we should probably stop. There's food. And I'm happy to chat if you guys want to chat. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I invite you all to enjoy the refreshments, continue to answer your questions. I know you always have a lot of questions, but you're not always, I didn't even have the energy to share them publicly. So